11 years ago, 476 people boarded a ferry on a Tuesday night in South Korea. Most of them were 16 years old. By the following morning, the whole country would be watching in silence as a ship slowly disappeared beneath the water, taking hundreds of children with it. And yet, what makes this story almost impossible to believe is not that the ship sank. It is that it did not have to. If you want to understand what really happened that morning, stay until the very end, because every single part of this story matters. Like and subscribe, and follow along until the end to understand the full truth. To understand what happened on that April morning, you first need to understand the ship itself, where it came from, and who was on it. The Sewol was not built in South Korea. It was built in Japan in 1994 by a company called Hayashikane Shipbuilding, and it spent its first 18 years operating quietly along Japanese coastal routes. Not a single incident, not a single accident. It was a large, well-functioning vessel, 146 meters long and 22 meters wide, capable of carrying over 900 passengers and more than 100 vehicles at a time. For nearly 2 decades, it did exactly what it was designed to do, without any trouble. In 2012, the ship was purchased by a South Korean company called Chonghae Marine for the equivalent of about $11 million. It was renamed the Sewol, a Korean word that carries a poetic meaning somewhere between the passing of time and going beyond the world. The company reflagged it, refitted it, and put it to work on a new route connecting the port city of Incheon, just west of Seoul, to the island of Jeju in the south, one of the most popular travel destinations in the country. The crossing takes roughly 13 hours overnight, and it was a route that ferries have been running for years. What happened during the refitting is where the first problem begins. Chonghae Marine made significant structural modifications to the Sewol. They added extra passenger cabins on the 3rd, 4th, and 5th decks, raising the total number of passengers the ship could carry and, crucially, adding considerable weight to the upper part of the vessel. They also increased the cargo capacity on the lower decks to carry more freight per voyage, which was where the real money was made. The South Korean maritime authorities reviewed these modifications. The Korean Register of Shipping signed off on them. Certifications were issued. Everything on paper looked fine. But in reality, what these modifications had done was fundamentally compromise the ship's stability. A ship's ability to stay upright depends on something called its center of gravity. When you add weight to the top of a ship without compensating at the bottom, you raise that center of gravity. The ship becomes top-heavy. It becomes vulnerable to listing, to tipping, to losing its balance in a way that a properly calibrated vessel simply would not. The engineers who built the Sewol in Japan had designed it with very specific parameters in mind. Chonghae Marine had violated those parameters in the name of profit, and the regulators whose entire job was to catch exactly this kind of problem had either not noticed or had not cared. It was later revealed that the licensing documents used to approve the modifications had been falsified. The former captain of the Sewol, a man who had stepped back from the role before the disaster, had reportedly warned the company multiple times that the ship was not stable enough to be carrying the loads it was being asked to carry. He was told to stop raising the issue or face losing his job. His warnings went nowhere. On the evening of April 15th, 2014, 325 students from Danwon High School in Ansan, a city south of Seoul, made their way to the port of Incheon. They were all second-year students, which in the South Korean school system means they were around 16 years old, and what will be the last relatively free stretch of their education before the pressure of university entrance exams took over their lives. The trip to Jeju Island was a 4-day school excursion, the kind of trip that their school had done many times before. For a lot of these students, it was one of the most anticipated events of their school year. The mood at the port was cheerful. Students took photos together. Some of them sent messages to their parents saying they were boarding. Teachers moved around checking lists, making sure everyone was accounted for. Along with the students and their teachers, there were also over 100 civilian passengers on board, families, tourists, workers making the overnight crossing to Jeju for various reasons. By the time the Sewol departed, it was carrying 476 people in total, including a crew of 33. The ship left Incheon 2.5 hours late that evening because of dense fog that had kept vessels at port throughout the afternoon. It was a minor delay. Nobody thought much of it. The students settled into their cabins, stayed up late talking, ate dinner on board, and eventually went to sleep as the ferry moved south through the night. It was an ordinary beginning to what should have been an ordinary school trip. What nobody on board knew was that the ship beneath them was carrying more than twice the legal amount of cargo. The official loading record stated 657 tons of freight. The actual figure was over 1,157 tons. The ship was also carrying 180 vehicles, more than its approved limit. And critically, much of this cargo had not been properly secured. The trucks and containers loaded in the vehicle bay were tied down insufficiently, some barely at all. At the same time, the ship's crew had pumped out hundreds of tons of ballast water from the bottom of the vessel to accommodate the excess freight above. Ballast water sits at the bottom of a ship specifically to keep it stable. The Sewol was carrying less than a third of the ballast water it needed. It was a vessel balanced on a knife's edge, loaded far beyond its limits, with almost nothing anchoring it from below. The sea that night was relatively calm. Nothing about the weather gave any indication of what was coming. At 8:30 the following morning, April 16th, the Sewol was moving through a stretch of water called the Mengol Channel, a narrow passage near the southwestern tip of the Korean peninsula known for its unusually strong underwater currents. The channel runs between several small islands, and any vessel passing through it needs to navigate carefully, particularly at speed, and particularly with a heavy load. At this point in the journey, the Sewol's captain, a man named Lee Jun-suk, was not on the bridge. In South Korean maritime law at the time, there was no requirement for the captain to be present on the bridge while a third officer was steering. The third officer on duty that morning was a young and relatively inexperienced crew member. She was at the helm as the Sewol entered the Mengol Channel. At 8:48 in the morning, the Sewol made a sharp turn to the right. Investigators later described it as an unreasonably sudden turn. An abrupt change in direction made at a speed that was too high for the conditions, in a channel known for powerful cross-currents. Whether it was a navigational error, an attempt to correct course after drifting slightly off track, or a consequence of the steering mechanism itself malfunctioning, is something that investigators have continued to debate. What is not in dispute is what happened next. The moment the ship turned, the unsecured cargo in the vehicle bay shifted. Hundreds of tons of trucks, containers, and cars that had been sitting loosely in place suddenly slid hard to the left side of the ship. The Sewol lurched. It began to lean, and it did not correct itself. Under normal circumstances, a properly ballasted ship with a low enough center of gravity would have righted itself after a sudden tilt like this. The weight at the bottom would pull it back, but the Sewol had almost no ballast water. Its center of gravity was already dangerously high from months of modifications and overloading. There was nothing to pull it back. The lean deepened, the angle increased, and within minutes, what had started as a gradual list became something irreversible. Passengers who were awake at the time felt the floor beneath them shift. Chairs slid, cups fell. In the student cabins, those who were still asleep were jolted awake by the sensation of the ship tilting beneath them. Some of them opened their eyes to find their belongings sliding across the floor and walls becoming the new ceiling. The tilt was fast enough to be frightening and slow enough to feel surreal. People grabbed onto whatever they could find. Then the intercom came on. The announcement told everyone on board to stay exactly where they were. Do not move. Stay in your rooms. Remain in your cabins. The message was calm. It was repeated, and the vast majority of people on board did exactly what they were told. They stayed. There is something important to understand about why people follow this instruction, and it is not naivety or lack of awareness. The passengers on the Sewol had no way of knowing what the crew knew or did not know. They had no way of assessing the ship's tilt from inside a cabin. When an authority figure on a ship, which is a highly controlled environment, tells you to stay where you are, the rational response is to comply. These students have been raised in a culture that places enormous weight on following instructions from those in authority. Their teachers were with them. Their teachers were also telling them to stay put. The official announcement was telling them to stay put. And many of them, even as the floor continued to tilt further and further, stayed. They sent messages to their parents. They filmed videos on their phones. They said, "I love you." They waited. What the passengers could not see was what was happening on the outer decks and on the bridge. Because while the intercom was telling 400 people to stay in their rooms, something else was taking place entirely. The Korean Register of Shipping had been approving the Sewol based on falsified documents, confirmed by the South Korean government's own Board of Audit and Inspection. The modifications that had made the ship dangerously top-heavy had been approved on the basis of paperwork that did not accurately reflect what had been done to the vessel. People whose entire profession was to prevent exactly this kind of disaster had looked the other way for years. Then came the question of who was ultimately behind Chonghae Marine. The company's official structure named certain individuals as owners and executives, but investigators discovered that the real control appeared to run deeper. The name that emerged at the center of the investigation was Yoo Byung-eun, a 73-year-old businessman and religious figure who had been involved with the company since its origins. Yoo was not a figure who appeared in public life in any conventional way. He was known in some circles as the millionaire with no face, a man of considerable wealth who went to extraordinary lengths to remain out of the public eye. He had founded and led a religious group officially known as the Evangelical Baptist Church of Korea, which critics refer to as the Salvation Sect, a tight-knit community of followers that functioned in many ways like a self-contained world, with its own compound, its own agricultural production, and an internal culture of intense loyalty to its leadership. Yoo had also built a secondary identity as an internationally exhibited photographer under the name Ahae, a persona that bore almost no resemblance to his background as a businessman and religious leader. The connection between Yoo's church and Chonghae Marine was one of the more unsettling threads that investigators pulled. Senior company employees were members of the Salvation Sect. The network of holding companies that controlled Chonghae was run largely by members of Yoo's inner circle, including his sons and brother-in-law. Investigators believed this structure had allowed Yoo to continue directing the company's operations even after officially stepping away years earlier. The embezzlement uncovered ran into tens of millions of dollars, siphoned through financial arrangements that prosecutors described as deliberate and systematic. It is important to note that the picture of Yoo Byung-eun that emerged in the media during this period was intensely controversial. Later press arbitration committees found that many specific claims linking him directly to the ship's operation and to the modifications that caused the sinking were not supported by evidence. His defenders maintained that he had genuinely retired from any involvement in the company years before. What was confirmed was that his family network had been running the company, that embezzlement had taken place on a significant scale, and that the company had been prioritizing profit over safety in ways that contributed directly to the deaths of April 16th. When prosecutors issued an arrest warrant for Yoo in May 2014, he vanished. South Korea launched its largest manhunt in history. 9,000 police officers joined the search. A reward of $500,000 was offered for information. His compound was raided by thousands of officers. For weeks, the most wanted man in South Korea remained nowhere to be found. In June 2014, a farmer working in a plum field in South Jeolla province noticed a body among the trees. It was identified through DNA and fingerprints as Yoo Byung-eun. The cause of death was never definitively established. Whether he had died of natural causes, taken his own life, or met some other end remained a source of speculation for years. Members of the Salvation Sect publicly refused to accept that the body was his. His burial was conducted inside the sect's compound, with hundreds of police surrounding the area and no media permitted inside. The captain, Lee Jun-suk, was initially sentenced to 36 years in prison for negligence. On appeal, the verdict was elevated. He was found guilty of murder committed through willful negligence, a charge that in South Korean law sits between gross negligence and deliberate intent, and he was sentenced to life in prison. He is currently incarcerated at Suncheon Correctional Institution. The chief engineer was also convicted of murder and sentenced to 30 years. 13 other crew members received sentences ranging from 2 to 12 years for abandoning the ship and violating maritime safety law. The chief executive of Chonghae Marine was convicted of negligence and sentenced to 10 years. By the end of the legal proceedings, more than 150 people had been arrested, charged, or convicted in connection with the disaster, including regulators, inspectors, loading company officials, and maritime safety personnel across multiple agencies. The Coast Guard captain responsible for the rescue operation was sentenced to 4 years in prison for negligence and falsifying official reports about the response. A separate chapter of the story involves the 3 crew members who, unlike their colleagues, stayed on board. Park Ji-young, the 22-year-old cabin crew member, was seen in the final recordings from inside the ship, helping passengers move toward exits and handing out life jackets. She refused an offer to be rescued. She went down with the Sewol. Her name is among those remembered most clearly in South Korea today. As the disaster unfolded on April 16th, something was happening in the presidential residence in Sewol that would become one of the most debated and politically consequential mysteries of the entire story. South Korea's president at the time was Park Geun-hye, the country's first female president and the daughter of the former authoritarian leader Park Chung-hee. She had been elected in 2012 and was 2 years into her presidency. On the morning the Sewol sank, Park Geun-hye was at the presidential Blue House, and the question of exactly what she did and did not do in the hours during which the ship was going down became one of the defining controversies of her time in office. The basic facts, established by prosecutors and confirmed through multiple investigations, are these. The president's office was aware of the sinking by approximately 9 in the morning. Reports were relayed to her staff. Yet Park Geun-hye did not appear at any official crisis management center until 5:15 in the afternoon, more than 7 hours after the situation had been known to her government. What she was doing during those 7 hours was never fully explained. Her office initially said she had been working from her private residence, receiving reports by phone and written document. When pressed, her staff said she was attending to official duties. No further detail was forthcoming. In a country where hundreds of people, most of them children, were dying in real time on live television, the president's absence from any visible crisis role became a focus of enormous anger. It later emerged that the initial reporting by the South Korean media that day had been deeply inaccurate. In the first hours after the sinking began, multiple major news outlets, citing official government sources, reported that all 476 people on board had been rescued. This false reporting circulated widely and may have contributed to the delay in public and official urgency about the scale of what was actually happening. The families of students who saw this news believed their children were safe. Hours later, the truth became clear, and the grief that followed was compounded by the feeling of having been misled. Prosecutors later found that Park's senior aides had falsified the official record of when the president had first been briefed on the disaster, altering the time to make it appear she had been informed later than she actually was. 4 of her former aides were charged with abuse of power and document falsification. The last known message sent by one of the students trapped in the Sewol was sent at 10:17 in the morning. Investigators concluded that by the time the president was officially supposed to have been briefed, the situation inside the ferry had already become unrecoverable. Public anger in South Korea over the government's response was immediate, sustained, and profound. Parents of the students camped outside government buildings for months. Families gathered near where the ship had gone down, waiting for news. Memorial spaces appeared across the country. Yellow ribbons, the symbol of the disaster and the ongoing demand for truth, were worn and displayed everywhere. South Korea entered a period of national grief that stretched far beyond what a typical disaster produces, because it was not just grief at a tragedy. It was grief combined with fury at a system that had failed at every possible level. The vice principal of Danwon High School, who had organized a trip that brought his students onto the Sewol, was among the survivors rescued on April 16th. 3 days later, he took his own life. He left a note in his wallet. It said that surviving alone was too painful when 200 lives were unaccounted for. The Sewol did not disappear quickly from South Korean public life. It stayed in the water and in the national consciousness for years. The wreck lay on the seafloor at about 40 meters off the coast of Jindo County for nearly 3 years, while debates about whether and how to raise it continued. The cost was estimated at between $90 million and $137 million. Some argued it was unnecessary, that the investigation had already established the causes. But for the families of the 9 whose bodies had not been recovered, leaving the ship on the ocean floor was not an option. For them, the Sewol was still a grave holding their children, their siblings, their parents. The salvage operation began in early 2017 and was one of the most technically complex ever attempted. The Sewol lay on its side, partially buried in sediment, in a stretch of sea with some of the strongest currents on the Korean coast. 66 steel cables were threaded beneath the hull by teams of divers working in dangerous conditions, connected to lifting beams that raised the ship slowly until it could be placed onto a semi-submersible transport vessel and carried to the port of Mokpo. When the Sewol came out of the water in March 2017, it was barely recognizable. The blue and white paint was gone. The hull was brown with rust, scratched and dented, covered in marine growth from nearly 3 years on the seafloor. The name painted on the side was no longer visible. Family members who had gathered on boats nearby watched as the ship emerged. Some called out the names of their missing loved ones. Some said, "Come home." The remains of 4 of the 9 missing passengers were found during the raising. Their families, who had been waiting 3 years, were finally able to bring them home. 5 people remain missing to this day. Among them, 2 16-year-old students, a teacher, and a father with his 6-year-old son. The search formally concluded in October 2018 without finding them. The wreck of the Sewol remains on the dock at the port of Mokpo, where it has sat since 2017, a physical object that South Korea has not yet decided what to do with. The political consequences of the Sewol extended far beyond the shipping industry. The anger that accumulated in the months and years after the sinking merged with a separate corruption scandal involving President Park and a woman named Choi Soon-sil, a confidant who had allegedly been using her access to the president to extort money from major corporations and manipulate government policy for personal gain. The combination of the ongoing grief over the Sewol and the new corruption scandal produced something extraordinary. Beginning in October 2016, South Koreans gathered in the streets every weekend to call for the president's resignation. At its peak, these protests drew close to 1 million people into central Seoul on a single Saturday, among the largest peaceful demonstrations in the country's history. The crowds held candles. They called for accountability. In December 2016, South Korea's parliament voted to impeach Park Geun-hye. In March 2017, the Constitutional Court upheld the impeachment, making Park the first South Korean president removed from office through that process. She was arrested later that month on corruption charges and eventually sentenced to 24 years in prison, though later pardoned. The Sewol disaster, and specifically the fury over how the government had handled it, was explicitly cited in the impeachment proceedings. South Korea responded to the Sewol in ways that went beyond politics. The country overhauled its maritime safety regulations. Stricter cargo loading requirements were introduced. Inspection processes were reformed. Laws were passed to hold companies more directly accountable when they prioritized profit over safety. The Coast Guard was restructured and new emergency response protocols developed. Whether these changes were sufficient and whether they would hold against the same pressures of profit and bureaucratic inertia that had allowed the Sewol to sail in the first place remained an open question. The name Sewol, which had once simply meant the passage of time in Korean, took on a new meaning after April 2014. It became the word South Koreans used to describe a certain kind of failure, the failure of the systems a society builds to protect people, and the question of what those systems owe to the people who trust them. The students who survived have grown up. They're in their mid to late 20s now. Some have spoken publicly about what it felt like to be told to wait, about what they remember from inside the tilting ship, about what it has meant to carry that day into adult life. For many of them, the central unanswered question was never why the ship sank, because the investigation answered that. It was the overloading, the compromised stability, the unsecured cargo, the reckless commercial decisions approved by a system that placed no real value on the consequences. The question they carry is simpler and much harder. If the evacuation order had been given in the first 30 minutes, how many would have made it off? The Sewol took 2.5 hours to sink. The students inside it, who stayed in their cabins because that is what they were told, had time. They had time that was never used. They sent their last messages in that time. They waited. In April every year, yellow ribbons appear again across South Korea. In Ansan, where Damwon High School still stands, the anniversary is marked with quiet and ceremony. The Sewol is not a story that South Korea has finished with. It is a story about what happens when the structures built to protect people are hollowed out from the inside, when profit replaces responsibility at every level, and when the people who should have been watching failed to watch. The Sewol is not a story South Korea has finished with. It is a story about what happens when the structures built to protect people are hollowed out from the inside, when profit replaces responsibility at every level, and when the people who should have been watching chose not to watch. Every certification that was signed on falsified documents, every overloaded manifest that passed inspection, every warning that was ignored, and every career threat that silenced a concerned voice was a small decision that seemed manageable in isolation. Together, they became catastrophic. It is a story about 476 people who boarded a ferry on a Tuesday night, and about the 304 who did not come home. Their names are known. Their faces are known. And 11 years later, South Korea has not forgotten them.